Good morning, everyone. My name is Omari Battles, and I am the Disabilities Access and Functional Needs DAFN project coordinator here for the City of Los Angeles Emergency Management Department. And I really want to thank you all for joining us today. This has been a huge effort to convene this group. Revitalizing this coalition has been one of the most important things to me, and actually one of the reasons why I came into this position to begin with a year and a half ago. The acronym DAFN stands for Disabilities, Access, and Functional Needs. And when looking at that acronym, DAFN, historically the city has placed a bit of a greater focus on the D within DAFN, which is understandable for a few reasons, but it's clearly overdue to ask ourselves, how can we maintain the progress we've made on the disability side while ensuring that the AFN side is giving equal attention and resources. The phrase access and functional needs incorporates people with physical, developmental, or intellectual disabilities, chronic health conditions or injuries, limited English proficiency, older adults, children in low-income households, homeless and or transportation disadvantaged, and pregnant women. Our hope is to ensure that we build, integrate, and sustain this coalition together in a way that works better for the people most in need. So we plan to develop a local emergency management coalition that is led by community leaders, which is why we have all of you on this line right now, and emergency managers that are committed to jointly establishing goals and objectives, identifying gaps, and implementing mutually beneficial protocols and best practices, measuring our results, and ensuring that there's equal access to those that are impacted by disasters. Now, the need to evaluate how emergency management oftentimes is not equitable is long overdue, and this is not suddenly a new area that's in need of attention. The example that jumps to mind initially is actually the disproportionate impact on people with disabilities and Black and Brown communities during Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans. There have also been more recent reports that have been highlighting the bias in the post-disaster loan application process, where the research has shown that after disasters, on average, Black residents lose wealth and white residents gain wealth. When it comes to disasters like floods, earthquakes, and fires, homeowners are more likely to benefit than renters. Yet it's well established who the majority of homeowners in America are, due to many long established barriers in housing discrimination through various policies. Historically, the federal government has spent billions of dollars helping communities rebuild and prevent further damage. Just last year in March, there was actually an NPR investigation that was done that found that across the country, white Americans and those with more wealth often receive more federal dollars after disaster than do minorities and those with less wealth. Federal aid isn't necessarily allocated to those who need it most. It's oftentimes allocated according to cost-benefit calculations meant to minimize taxpayer risk. So essentially, after disaster, rich people often get richer and poor get poorer, and federal disaster spending appears to exacerbate that wealth inequality. Studies by sociologists as well as climate scientists, urban planners, and economists suggest that disasters and the federal aid that follows disproportionately benefits wealthier Americans. The same is also true along racial lines, with white communities benefiting disproportionately. Now with COVID, the many years of discriminatory, exclusive racist policies are also being exposed and exacerbated, where we are now seeing how the current data is showing that Black and Latino people are 2 times more likely to die than white people and 3 times more likely to get sick. When we look at things such as environmental racism, to food deserts, to the many uninsured or underinsured communities, to the wealth gap, to redlining, the list goes on. Historical racism is the cause for COVID impacting Black and Latino communities the hardest. These are examples why a coalition like this is important as they connect to this field of emergency management. And our vision is that the conversations that emerge from this coalition over time plays a role in helping to ensure that this system really works better for all people.
Thank you for joining us. My name is Daisy Gonzalez. I am the Emergency Management Coordinator for the City of Los Angeles Department on Disability. Our mission here for the coalition is to establish a platform that will serve for active dialogue among the City of Los Angeles and the agencies that are represented here. We will discuss and share best practices and discuss the existing gaps in emergency preparedness among the population we serve. Based on the conversations, the coalition will provide support within the city's integrated emergency preparedness, response, and recovery functions. Throughout the year, the coalition will develop task force groups to serve as subject matter experts in the review of the city's emergency plans and educational materials. The coalition will also assist in the planning of and will participate in emergency exercises conducted by the city and other partner agencies. Today's meeting is a cornerstone of an ongoing conversation to strengthen community and city emergency response.
Thank you, Daisy, and good morning, everyone. I'm Stephen Simon, Executive Director of the City of Los Angeles Department on Disability. So today we reconstitute this coalition and we re-envision its role to truly incorporate community input in our emergency planning, response, and recovery. To do so, we will address real-life current events as we begin to dissect both community needs and city response to the COVID-19 pandemic. The city has been operating under a state of emergency since the first week of March, which is now over 4 months. Testing sites were created and temporary hospital space expanded, and of course, safer at home orders announced by state, county, and city officials. How is community involved in those decisions? How is community impact assessed? What role can community play in addressing the pandemic as it continues? Our panel will present key elements of this discussion, from the racial justice implications of COVID-19 to the role of the city's soon-to-be-created Department of Civil and Human Rights. They'll speak to the impacts on people with disabilities and others with access and functional needs, and the nature of community engagement itself. So now back to Omari to introduce our panel.
We have 4 amazing guest speakers with us today. Before we go into that, I do want to give a few basic rundown for how it's going to actually go. So the panelists, the presentations are going to run for approximately 40 minutes in total, and then we are going to take questions through the chat feature that is utilized within Zoom. For those of you all who are joining by phone or who are having other issues, you can submit questions via email using the link that I'm using the address that Rosemary shared earlier. Again, that address was dod.emergencyprep@lacity.org. After the panel, there will be a Q&A, and we will then break out into 2 groups. I'm going to have a facilitated dialogue to get a better idea about your perceptions. Jody David Armour is an author, playwright, USC professor of law, and a widely published scholar and popular lecturer. He has published an award-winning book, Negrophobia and Reasonable Racism, and various law review articles. His forthcoming book, *GGA Theory, Race, Language, Unequal Justice, and Law, and the recent article, Law, Language, and Politics. He teaches a diverse array of subjects, including criminal law, torts, and stereotypes. We also have with us Robert Sowell. Robert is the Assistant Executive Director of the County of Los Angeles Commission on Human Relations. In this role, he provides administrative oversight to commission staff and operations, including documentation and prevention of and response to bias-motivated hostility, increasing equity in law enforcement, and the county's dispute resolution program that makes mediation services available throughout LA County. Capri Maddox was recently nominated as the first executive director of the newly established Los Angeles Department of Civil and Human Rights. This department will be tasked with protecting Angelenos from discrimination that denies equal treatment in private employment, housing, education, or commerce by initiating and investigating complaints of discrimination, as well as enforcing the LA Civil and Human Rights Ordinance. She's a former president of the LA Board of Public Works, and she's also created the Foster Care Diversion Program, organized the City Attorney Faith-Based Council, and addressed key neighborhood council and city council requests. TJ Hill. TJ comes to DCRC, the Association of Community Health Service Agencies, where he served as the Mental Health Policy Director for almost 10 years, representing nonprofit provider agencies in LA County mental health system. Before that, he worked at the Disability Rights Legal Center, where he served as Director of Options, Counseling, and Lawyer Referral Services, supervising and coordinating the agency's legal intake process. Prior to Disability Rights Legal Center, he was a congressional legal intern for Senator Tom Harkin of Iowa in Washington, D.C., where he worked on special education policy, healthcare, and labor issues. That is our introductions. I will turn over to our first presenter.
I'm glad to kind of set the table in my remarks on why civil rights has bearing on how we think about emergency response, how we think about crises, how our response to different crises, our responses vary as a function of the social identity of the victims of those crises. And I'd say probably the most paradigmatic example of that is Hurricane Katrina. And I think that understanding what happened after Hurricane Katrina with those Black folks in the Ninth Ward standing on those rooftops with water coming up to their necks for day after day. 4 days in, Sean Penn is rowing up, handing out fresh water because FEMA still couldn't get its act together despite Black people with water up to their necks for 4 days. Really understanding the empathy deficit that was reflected in that response or lack thereof, and how that kind of indifference is what drives public policy in crises that involve Black victims. And we can start talking about other socially marginalized victims as well from stereotyped groups, but I'm specifically focusing on Black victims here because I do have some studies that are discussed in my forthcoming book, Omari, that I appreciated your deft handling of when it came to quoting the title, because it is nigger theory, you're right. And that is a blood-soaked epithet that has been used to demonize and otherize and dehumanize Black people for centuries. So it's a word that I use advisedly, but in order to make some points like the ones that I'm getting ready to get to now, about how we think about social problems when they affect Black people. When they affect Black people, we respond to them like we did to the Black victims of Hurricane Katrina. Compare the Hurricane Katrina response to the response after 9/11, when those planes ran into those buildings and there was a panic of empathy for those victims. We just got it done. Nobody wanted to talk about any bureaucratic red tape, any impediments of a bureaucratic nature at all. We just had an outpouring of empathy, sympathy, care, and compassion for those victims, and we got them help, right? The same kind of empathy, and at least panic of empathy, is not there. The kind of empathy you have when a family member is in distress. That kind. Not a kind of an abstract matter that you hear about, there's a tragedy somewhere, sometime, but one that you feel in your bones because you feel connected and responsible in some way. That hasn't been there for Black victims of crises. Some of the material I get to in my book, in the empirical literature, is we're now, when I started talking about race and the unconscious, I used to have to say, here's race and here's your brain on race, right? But we had to look at the people's brains on race, how their perceptions and judgments were changed kind of indirectly with information processing approaches to human cognition that gave us some timing differences and things. But now, more lately, and this is the research I get into now, with fMRIs, we can actually see your brain on race and see how it is perceiving and responding when it's making judgments to out-group members. And we see that with the mirror neurons don't fire for out-group members. They do for in-group members. Mirror neurons are the brain neurons that allow you to simulate what you see. You see someone taking a sip of water, you do one, so you simulate that in your brain without actually going through the motions physically. Those are the basic building blocks of sympathy and empathy. What these studies show is that in-group members, say a white person seeing a black person drink a cup of water, their mirror neurons don't fire. So at the most basic level of the building blocks of empathy, they aren't there for out-group members. So that's why there is not that panic of empathy in many places for victims when those victims are seen to come from out-groups. And if we don't understand that, I kind of just sum this part up by saying that is the connection I see between the COVID-19 crisis and the protests in the streets and the uprisings. What we've seen is that just police interventions, tinkerings, technological interventions like body cams, or policy interventions like implicit bias training, community de-escalation, all that didn't work at all. That there were some deeper problems, and those deeper problems have to do with the fact that Black lives don't matter. They haven't mattered since the inception of this nation. And we see in our public policy responses to crises that we don't have the same level of care and concern. We don't have the same level of sympathetic identification. And now I've been able to identify that on a cognitive level, at the level of the mirror neurons. And we have to figure out how we're going to overcome that deeply baked in bias that we have.
I really appreciate the opportunity to be here with you on the panel. As a fellow lawyer, I promise I will be brief, but to definitely to the point, I'm excited to be the incoming executive director of the Civil and Human Rights Department. And in that role, we will cover a number of things. We will have commission oversight and support given to a number of commissions, the Commission of the Status of Women, the Human Relations Commission, and of course, the Civil and Human Rights Commission. I will also add that the Transgender Advisory Council will also be a part of our operation. And then we have a number of things we will be doing in the community engagement events as it relates to reducing hate crimes, dealing with awareness for all underrepresented groups, including our disabled population. And then the other things that we'll be dealing with, of course, is I love that we'll have enforcement powers. So when people do things that are inappropriate or violate the Civil and Human Rights Ordinance, we actually will have an ability and a mechanism to enforce those laws. Sorry, guys, I have a little bit of vocal cord damage. So the deal is that we're interested in moving the agenda forward also, not only being satisfied that people aren't going to be victims of hate crimes or have to deal with hate speech or hate incidents. You guys know just all communities have been touched by discriminatory practices and hate crimes, of course. We saw in the paper yesterday, there were so many stories about discrimination, and it's in our face. It's something that we cannot avoid, and we shouldn't have held off on having some of these serious conversations for so long, and to wait until there was a crisis for all of this to come up. Again, even yesterday, the mayor was talking to some of our API leaders, our Asian Pacific Islander brothers and sisters, because of the issues related to the COVID crisis and increased hate crimes against that group. But I really want to be clear that the COVID crisis is something that we've worked on in a number of ways. We have the Office of Racial Equity and Empowerment. It'll be a part of our department as well. We'll do things like upward mobility events and have an opportunity to deal with industry metrics as it relates to how people are hired, et cetera. But another component of that will be the COVID-19 equity piece. And some of you know that the mayor also has appointed me to serve as the Chief Equity Officer for the COVID-19 response. And in this space, we're looking at making sure that the resources and testing sites are in communities where there is need. The other thing too is that we're doing outreach programs with certain providers and making sure that we have partnerships with people that will provide additional resources and make donations for this cause. Some of you guys have seen Sean Penn step up, as Professor Armour has mentioned. We know that it takes all people to help in a crisis, and we need the empathy for our communities. And I think actually some things that are happening with the response on the national level are related to the fact that so many people of color are suffering from this disease and actually dying from it. We know that if you're African American or Latino, you're like 3 times more likely to be sickened by the COVID virus. And the other thing too that I think is really important for us to know is that racism and discriminatory practices are embedded in so many of these challenges. When you think of it, the numbers are going up with our Latinx population in the last week. And those numbers don't represent a lack of testing and other things that people may assume, or basic hygiene. It's about the fact that so many of those folks are essential workers. So many of those folks live in cramped housing situations. So we know that racism and discriminatory practices are a part of the problem. And then, of course, for a very long time, and our numbers are still very high with the African American population. And I want to just speak to a couple of things as it relates to the disabled population. We know that in LA County, 1 out of 5 people say that they have a disability. And when you think about the disabled population, we understand that they're 60% more likely to be impacted by the COVID pandemic than other groups. So we have to basically lean in to see where the need is. I don't have to tell you guys that government has been a part of the problem for so many communities over the years, and discriminatory practices is just one brush of it. But we know that racial covenants, for example, we have segregated schools, and even the fire department in years gone by, using water hoses to spray protesters, peaceful protesters. And so when government has been a part of problems and allowing some even environmental racism to happen, I happen to have asthma, which is a comorbidity factor, but it was probably based on the environments that I grew up in as a kid. I actually have had challenges with asthma since my childhood. And so we know that when people don't have the empathy, as the professor mentioned, and have racism and discriminatory practices that are allowed to run rampant and even are supported indirectly by government practices and rules, that as government leaders, we have a role and an obligation to lean in to right some of the wrongs of history. And that is what we wish to do in supporting our communities of color and our underserved communities, particularly our disabled population. Thank you.
Thank you, Capri. And our next speaker is Robert Sowell. Welcome.
Good morning. Thank you. And thank you, Stephen, Omari, Daisy. Thank you for the opportunity to participate in this panel, in this event. And Capri and TJ, I'm delighted to be on the panel with you, and Jody. Capri, thank you for that description of making a difference so that what has happened before is not what's going to happen in the future. And Jody, thank you for that compelling reminder that inequity is neither new nor coincidental. I want to remind us, I know that we would all embrace the fact that what has been only limits what will be if we choose to accept that limitation. And among the actions that we must choose to do right now is community engagement in order to move past what has already been described of the dire situation that we're in now. If we want to ensure that the past inequity is a launching pad for advancing equity, we need to make sure that we engage genuinely with community. So I want to take just a moment to talk about this essential element of our action agenda, just a bit about the what of community engagement, and then a few beginning thoughts on the how. So I want to start my description of what community engagement must be if it is to advance equity by calling to mind what's likely a first-hand experience for many of us, and probably at least familiar to most of us from something you've seen or heard about. I'm talking about those times when the whole family comes together. Parents and children, partners and grandparents, uncles and cousins, everybody. You know, those huge family gatherings back in the old days, before March. And when it came time to eat, everybody sat down at the table, at least all the big people, the so-called grown-ups. The little people, they had their own table, the kids' table. And think about what it was like the first time you were considered big enough to sit at the grown-ups table. At least the grown-ups thought it was a pretty big deal and expected you to think so too. Of course, you still had to make sure to sit in one of the open spaces. You certainly couldn't sit in Aunt Sophia's chair or Cousin Joe's place. And of course, you still had to eat what was served. They might let you help set the table the way they told you to set it, but planning the meal, depending on who you were in the family, not an option. And if it was, you still had to wait your turn. My point is that many agencies, many government groups think of community engagement a lot like that. That you should appreciate if you're even allowed to sit at the table and enjoy what other people decided they wanted to do for you. This is what many governments and agencies have in the past understood that community engagement is, and I think we all recognize that it only exacerbates and continues and strengthens the othering that's already been described. We need to recognize that the historical inequities we're continuing to experience have included and been supported by what has been done to and even for communities. So by community, I'm talking about all those who are affected by and impacted by the benefits, the resources, the services that are being provided, whether it's emergency planning, disaster response, or any of the other resources that we want to be able to distribute. Today, we're focusing on communities of color, communities of persons with disabilities, with access and functional needs, their families, others related to their experiences, anyone with a stake in what's being done. Merely informing or consulting or even involving community not only rarely advances equity, it most often reinforces existing and historical inequity. Equity requires that we move to community engagement that is deciding and acting with community and even supporting and resourcing decisions by community and actions of community. In other words, community engagement that advances equity is far more than merely being sure they hear about what's being done or have opportunity to react to what's been planned for them. It even goes beyond merely asking their input in the planning process. Community engagement that advances equity is rooted in participatory democracy, not mere representative democracy. And so it requires sharing and even shifting power so that all stakeholders are empowered for collaborative planning and oversight of policies and programs that achieve community priorities and community-defined outcomes. So the level of collaboration that's needed for community engagement that advances equity requires personal relationships. Jody talked in such a graphic way about what he called empathy deficits. And that's exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about the othering that it's so easy for us to identify that we're providing for them. We are planning for them. We are doing for them as opposed to us. And in order for us to move past that, we have to invest the time in personal relationships. Over a long period of time, investing time for personal relationships of trust, where we engage together genuinely, will begin to change how those neurons fire, how those mirror neurons fire, when we begin to think of folks as we instead of them and us. And so it requires personal relationships. It requires welcoming environments. This kind of community engagement means that the processes we use when we make decisions have to be engaging so that everyone genuinely is a full partner in the process. It requires accessible venues, the locations of the gatherings. Currently, that's mostly electronic, digital, right? And so how is it that we can make sure that those platforms, those venues are genuinely accessible to all the people who need to be participating at a time when they can participate with language that they know? And I'm not just talking about languages, sign language or Spanish or Korean or English. I'm also talking about the terminology we use, because so often when we get together, we fall into code words of technical terms, and we're just reminding people, well, if you don't understand what these acronyms stand for, that's just a reminder that you're a guest here and you're not a full engaged member or partner. It also means, welcoming environments also means that we think about incentives and compensation. When we have these decision-making opportunities and policy-making, and we're reviewing and deciding what's going to be done and how it will be done, or review what has been done, the people who are there from government and agencies, they're probably there on their work time. They're working, but we expect community members to be there as volunteers outside of work, and we don't think about, well, how would we respect their time and expertise with incentives and compensation as well. So I think you'll agree with me that moving to community engagement that advances rather than hinders equity involves changes in attitude as much as activity. Governments and agencies have to cultivate an attitude of servant leadership, where public service means serving the community, not merely service to or for the community. It requires humility and skills and deep listening, including cultural humility. By that I mean that I acknowledge that I don't and I will never fully and completely know your culture. So I'm always a learner, and I'm an eager learner, because I don't merely tolerate diversity. I don't even just enjoy our differences. I actually value diversity as essential to the richest experience and best outcomes for all of us. It also requires that we have courage to insist on and persist in needed change. And of course, communities need an attitude of patience as governments and agencies adjust, but determination not to quit until they are fully and equitably engaged. So let me close by just reminding us of an example of what can happen. Someone named Ed Roberts, who's considered by many to be one of the catalysts of the independent living movement for persons who are challenged for personal mobility. He wasn't expected to live past childhood after contracting an illness that left him almost completely paralyzed from the neck down, but he survived. When he was a young teenager, he stopped eating in an attempt to end his own life. And this is how he described what happened next. Quote, "They started to force feed me. It was really demeaning. I dropped to 54 pounds. My last special duty nurse left. And the next day, I decided I wanted to live." You see, that was a big turning point. Up until then, these nurses were available and doing things for me around the clock. I didn't have to make any decisions for myself because they were always there. When they all finally left, that's when I realized that I could have a life, despite what everyone was saying. I could make choices, and that is freedom. I started to eat again, end quote. Well, Ed went on to finish high school, college, eventually graduate school, working both in community-based organizations and leading government agencies. He was a pioneer in advocating for accommodations for students and in genuine engagement of community members in processes that were being sponsored by government agencies. Later, he was a champion of the possibilities and needed support for persons with disabilities and access and functional needs at the local, state, and national levels. One small example that you see every day of his influence is the curb cut on every corner that forms a slight ramp from the street up onto the sidewalk. Ed Roberts led the advocacy that produced that change, bringing many of his fellow community members into the process for the first time. He traveled all over the world to show people that having a disability is not a barrier to a rich, full life. It's society that has constructed the barriers of inequity in the forms of inaccessible sites, low expectations, stereotypes, exclusion, condescension. Replacing these injustices with equity requires genuine, full, equitable community engagement. I'll be happy to talk about this more and answer questions as we proceed. Thank you.
TJ, thank you and welcome.
Hi, good morning, everyone. It is a pleasure to be on this panel with such esteemed colleagues. So I didn't realize that we had so many lawyers on the panel. I consider myself a lawyer in recovery, partly because of my disappointment that going into law would, be the hallmark of social justice and bring equity. And if anything, what I learned through law school and then ensuing in my career was that inequality and inequity in our system was just amplified oftentimes by government and by the law. So I come today as the executive director of the Disability Community Resource Center in Western Los Angeles. We used to be the West Side Center for Independent Living. Ed Roberts was a frequent visitor of our center and was a big reason why we started. So I appreciate those comments by Robert. So I like to think about disability and social justice in the way it overlaps with these other issues of inequity and the impacts on our community. We've heard a lot about Katrina sort of being the big wake-up call for how Black Americans were valued less in emergency situations. But to me, when Katrina happened, as horrific as it was no surprise to me at all. These were the issues that were on display during that crisis had been talked about and talked about and talked about for years and years. That this was a crisis that was we were almost inevitably going to witness. And what I saw in that crisis and the crises that have continued time and time after again is that people with disabilities are by far the folks that are being impacted. And that is amplified on the intersectionality of their identities. So when I think about intersectionality in academia, we tend to talk about intersectionality as being this sort of really positive thing that we should be aware of. But I like to think about intersectionality as the intersectionality of risk. Because the more identities that you layer on an individual or that an individual has, the less they are welcomed at that table, the less the power they have. And that is what I think of when I think about this intersectionality, because we're really talking about the multiple risk factors and then the multiple vulnerabilities of folks. So the first premise that I always go into planning meetings and talking to people about is we have to understand and just accept on a basic level that we live in an equitable world. And that is not an easy concept for people to think about. We like to think that here in America, everyone is the land of opportunity and everybody has a fair shake. And we know that that's far from true. So we need to stop planning and emergency planning like we are in the land of the free and equal opportunity. We need to be planning and thinking about that we live under a regime of systemic institutional racism, inequity, classism, and with huge disparities in economic opportunity in this country. When I think about all of this within the context of COVID-19, I have been very passionate during this pandemic because this is a genocide on the disability community right now. We are experiencing a genocide, and you have to speak that truth for people to understand. I have been fighting with public health, with the CDC, give us the statistics of how many people are actually dying with disability. And the little bit of statistics that we're even able to get out of these entities that are horrifying, because it is 99% of the folks are people with disabilities. So when we put COVID-19 in this context of racial justice in particular, and the intersectionality of risk for disability, we have to think about all of these risk factors and all the vulnerabilities that are coexisting at one time in one person and in one community. Obviously, through these institutions, we have a lack of access to healthcare. That is a huge issue. When people are getting sick, they don't go to the doctor because they don't have a doctor. They're not going to go to the emergency room because everyone's told the emergency room is a dangerous place to go. Folks that are particularly at risk are also in high-risk essential jobs where they have not been able to shelter in place. They have a lack of access to childcare. And so more likely that children are going to be placed with family members or multiple family members, moved around. That's also exposing a greater risk. Housing is a huge issue. Not only the lack of housing for those that are homeless, but generational living within our communities and cramped living, which Capri mentioned. Food deserts and nutrition. The food deserts we know have created higher rates of obesity and heart disease in communities that are more at risk. The environmental justice issues that lead to greater cases of asthma and respiratory disease. Smoking, well, we think that if you look at the statistics, smoking is pretty equal between African Americans and whites. However, the health disparities are not equal. So African Americans are more likely to die of a respiratory illness if they are a smoker. They also, while they actually smoke less than whites, they have greater health disparities as a result. So that is another, one of these risk factors. When we think about these communities too, I've been very pointed at looking at Asian men in particular who have higher rates of smoking and have also been disproportionately impacted by COVID-19. So I think that is something that we have to look at, all of these layers of, again, the intersectionality of risk. So how do we address these issues in a crisis like this? We can't solve all of these things in short term. That's been our biggest failure in crisis management. We sort of think of, okay, so we have all these things. How do we solve those things in the short term when there's a disaster? And when Katrina happened, there was no way that you were going to solve poverty when people needed basic healthcare and evacuation and housing and medical interventions. So if we can't solve these in the short term, how do we as emergency planners or folks that are thinking about creating resiliency in your communities deal with it? And it's about creating, reducing that intersectionality of risk and creating protective factors in our community. At the center, we work to build resiliency in the long term. That's what independent living is about. So the disability community is particularly, I think, attuned to these issues of intersectionality of risk and how do we build resiliency. In this crisis, one of the things that I think is also noted is we have to acknowledge that there's a huge digital divide in this country, and that is a digital divide that happens mostly along economic lines. And obviously that has race and racial implications and also implications within our disability community. As we're looking to build those resiliency, we have to identify our communities most at risk. And this is again where that regime of systemic institutional racism hits us again, because these communities are considered hard to count under the census, HTC populations. And if you're in an HTC population, you're less likely to get those government services. But the thing that we also don't talk about is that those hard to count populations are also the populations that have been most betrayed by our government over the years. So they're going to be distrustful of the government. Even the example that Capri gave, you know, people think, well, first responders, fire, right? Well, fire responders don't have the best perception in a lot of our communities, because they, even in those first responders, have been used as a means of oppression and violence against communities. So we work a lot to do our coalition building within our communities, and I think it's important for government to reach out to churches and faith leaders. It's important to look at the community service organizations that people might be working in. And most importantly, it's to go to the people directly. We get caught up, I think, in our academic world sometimes of just raising these issues and pointing out the disparities and not going to the community and the people. And I think Robert spoke to that very well. So with that, I'll open it up for questions, but thank you for having us today.
Awesome. Thank you all. We're going to head right into the Q&A. We've allotted 15 minutes for this portion. Again, as a reminder, feel free to type in your questions into the chat box on your right or email them to the address we have. About 4 right now. So the first one, I'm going to address this to all the panelists. You all can respond as you choose or not. You don't feel obligated to answer each one, but if you want to answer the question, feel free to. So how do you think the city can better engage community in the context of COVID?
As it relates to the COVID crisis, we know that the mayor has done an amazing job in reaching out and keeping people informed and making sure that we have resources available. Again, we know we have an email or internet access issues for certain people in the community, but we do drive people to the coronavirus.lacity.org site, where there is a number of resources as it relates to services, housing opportunities, the Angelino card, and other resources that are there for folks. So we make sure that all the information is not merely on the internet. We make sure that we have it televised. We also make sure that we have information at some of our community-based organizations, our philanthropic partners, definitely our neighborhood councils, and some local institutions like our schools, LAUSD, and local universities. So we try to make sure that we're out. We have partners and great partners with the county and a number of organizations like Robert's group. And I want to be sure that we're very intentional on what we do. We even have a large presence on social media as well. This last week, the mayor and I were at Edrin Health Center with one of our celebrities, Anthony Anderson, to encourage people to take, and you guys may know Anthony Anderson, he plays the father on the show Blackish, and he was encouraging people to definitely follow the COVID prevention guidelines. And so we're doing so many things in the community, and I think it's really important to just touch quickly on TJ's point about the intersectionality of people's needs and where they are. We know that if African Americans have higher numbers, we also know that as it relates to the COVID crisis, but we also have the highest prevalence of disabilities. From what I know is 33.5% of African Americans have disabilities. And of course, our aging population has also, been hit hard. And that is why we're actually, wrapping up testing. And now we're doing testing for our nursing home facilities in greater numbers as well. So we're working on the solution, but a lot of this, like I said earlier, fell on local government because the response from the federal government was inadequate. And we see that a lot of times whenever we have disasters. And I'll just say this as I close. I worked for the city housing department from 92 to 96. And during that time, we had the civil unrest in 92, and we had the earthquake. And I learned early in my career that there is a distinct difference in how people respond to emergencies. Of course, we know that in the early hours of the civil unrest, there was no response from government at all. Whereas, and it took a long time for some of those communities to come back. But then, of course, when we had the earthquake, in 1994, we had resources back, and you can drive around Northridge and there's like really no sign that anything went wrong. And I do know that there are different types of disasters, but again and again and again, when we see a disaster and we see the response as relates to communities of color, disadvantaged communities that are dealing with poverty, and we also know that I believe we have, I think it's like 28 or 30% of our disabled population is living in poverty. When we have communities that are in need or underserved, the service gets even worse as it relates to the response from government, a lot of times the federal government, as it relates to the response. But for us in LA City, we're stepping it up and we're doing things that we don't normally do, like even providing testing. So I feel comforted that we aren't where we want to be, but we're not where we could be. And we are working hard to move that equity needle, because we are really aware that we do not want to miss this moment to serve our communities in need, especially in these days. Thank you.
Okay, if not, I'll go on to this next question. How do we as a coalition decipher sincere equity from a bureaucratic sense of equity that stems from the current government's agenda and promotes tokenism or favoring one social justice movement over the other?
This is Robert. I just would offer one brief piece of that, and that is that the encouragement that we think about equity in terms of outcome, not just our intent. There are many things that we do, and I speak that way as someone who works in county government. There are many things that we intend to do, but we need to recognize that we don't know what we don't know. And all the speakers have said something about the things that we don't see. And so we have to be able to monitor outcome. What are people who are being affected experiencing? How do they describe what's happening? And it feels to me like that one of the great assets of this coalition will be that, to give that kind of opportunity to genuinely hear back What is it that you're not aware of? What is it that you're not seeing? What is it that we don't know that we're missing, that many different parts of the community will be able to highlight? Equity then means that we're engaged in such a way that we're changing those outcomes beyond just making sure that our process is fair or the intent is to be fair, but actually the outcome is equitable.
I agree with Robert. A lot of times we don't really fully recognize perhaps who is suffering, who among us, who of our neighbors are really in despair. And that may be why we're indifferent. That may drive some of our indifference. But, you know, all it takes is a brief walk through Skid Row, right here in downtown LA, the fiercest expression of structural violence in America. And you look to the left and right and you see what? Black faces, 75%. Forrest Stewart, and down and out and under arrest. He's at Stanford now. When he was an ethnographer, spent 5 years in Skid Row and got those statistics. It was very sobering to me at the time. We had to pinpoint cite them, 75%. And that is kind of really what we're talking about when we're, you know, you see people in the streets talking about Black Lives Matter. It just doesn't seem like the gravity of even the homelessness problem itself is striking people in the way it might if they weren't disproportionately Black faces in that direst of despair, our most maligned and marginalized citizens. That they happen to be Black makes it easier for us to treat them like the 9th Ward victims after Hurricane Katrina, you know, because that Skid Row is like Hurricane Katrina 24/7, 365. You know, it's just an ongoing Hurricane Katrina 9th Ward.
I'll go on to the next question unless another panelist wanted to add on to that last one. Okay. From the emergency management side, how do we ask the public to quote unquote prepare when they live in an environment where they don't have the resources to stock preparedness materials? Where now with COVID, if we're asking someone to limit contact, but they live in a multi-family home where people are exposed on a daily basis because they have to work and use public transit.
I'll take a shot at that one. So we have to stop asking that question of asking people to prepare. That just perpetuates that regime of systemic institutional racism and inequality. And that is our biggest failure, is to say, it's actually one of the things that we've talked about at the Disability Community Resource Center, and we're working on a project right now to develop a curriculum that is based on disaster preparedness, emergency preparedness for people with disabilities, by people with disabilities, because we've seen that the curriculums for preparedness have been created by the able-bodied community paternalistically to, you know, hey, get a week's worth of, you know, I love the thing we see, and get a week's worth of medication. Make sure you always have a week's worth of medication. There are people who don't even have access to medication. So, you know, going and even having that conversation, it's so dismissive and dehumanizing to their actual experience. And so we need to, as a community, bring those resources and those tools to our communities to build resiliency. We can't ask our communities that are already disadvantaged to build their own resiliency. Everyone can come up with a plan. You know, that there was a study a number of years ago talking about the inequity in disaster preparing. And they looked at a number of respondents that had been in the study and divided them by race. And one of the base questions was, what is your emergency plan to shelter or to evacuate? And almost all of the white participants had a plan to go stay with relatives in another state. Not one of the Black respondents had that same plan. And again, that spoke to those inequalities. So we have to stop asking our communities to just do it on their own and build the resilience. So we need to bring those resources and bring those tools to our community, and ask them what their actual needs are, and not telling them, make sure you have enough water, drinking water in your garage, which is another one. It's like assuming that people have a garage or they have a car, or that, it's like just these assumptions on assumptions on assumptions. And we need to stop having those assumptions and actually bring the resources that build resiliency in our communities most at risk.
Did anyone else want to chime in on that? Okay. What if this coalition did have a committee that creates a bold and unprecedented vision to eliminate poverty and racial disparities, one that could be built into existing planning around emergencies and sustainability? What could that look like?
I'll take a stab at it. I think, and I actually, because I did emergency management so early in my career, with the civil unrest of 1992 and then the Northridge earthquake of 94, planning for earthquakes and disasters in general kind of became something that I worked on for many years, and even writing some disaster plans for housing developments for LA County. And in that space, I agree with TJ 100% that we would have a lot of the plans leaning toward the able-bodied population, and then there'd be like 1 or 2 sections, like kind of at the end of the document that would say, if you're disabled, these are the 3 things, and you do, and it wasn't, really well thought out. And I think had I had the opportunity to do that all over again, we would definitely be sure that we would engage with partners on what are the situations. So like, say, for example, if I'm going to work on upward mobility events to level the playing field as executive director of the Civil and Human Rights Department, as a part of the Office of Racial Equity, I look to where the needs are. So if I'm talking to a planning event about people going to college, I'm going to talk about definitely some of the, and if it's for underserved community, I'm going to talk about the needs that they may have, the financial aid needs, of course. Some of the parents may not, especially if you have a first generation kid, the parents may not be able to guide the students. So to also educate the parents in some communities, especially our immigrant communities, they don't want their kids to go far away to school, or, again, someone that's first generation may have a parent that won't understand that only having to pay or take a loan for $20,000 for a degree that is worth $400,000 makes sense. And also just to understand, living with, roommates and living away from home, and the expense and the benefits of all of that. So we meet the communities where they are, and what we do once government makes a stand to serve a community, we need to be all in. And in that space, we need to have TJ and a number of experts in this field, our executive director of the Department of Disability Science, they need to be there while you're making the document, and to vet the documents for you. And I think it would be very clear to understand that in our office buildings, we have mechanisms to help people that are disabled get out of office buildings, but we don't really have substantial plans and guidelines and descriptions of what you do if someone is at home. So I just think that planning with our partners and having that discussion, having that dialogue, and not only as it relates to disasters, because unfortunately we're dealing with a lot of disasters and things that are a little weird in 2020, but under normal circumstances, you don't have disasters every day. I think incorporating our disabled population in all we do and all that government does, and to operate through that lens, just like we're operating through an equity lens now, we need to stand up and make sure that the disabled population is a major component of the equity lenses that we're looking through now and forevermore. Thank you.
Expanding on the last comment about people with disabilities, we have a question. With the current school closures, how are the needs of kids with disabilities and access functional needs going to be addressed?
I worked with the school district last year, and I wanted to, I actually led partnerships for Austin Butner, the current superintendent of LA Unified. And in those days, I learned a lot about the schools, and I think our schools really are stepping up service to communities in need. And I think that on our big radar screen, again, I was just there for a year doing a special project with Southern California grant makers. We know that those students that are in need, that are dealing with poverty and food insecurities, you know, are top of mind, and they have grab and go centers. And I appreciate the fact that we have those centers and resources for students, and actually at those grab and go centers, I believe there's 63 of them within the school district boundaries. They have other resources that are present. I know for sure we had information about domestic violence and other needs that people may have, of course, testing information. But to answer the question directly about exactly what we're doing for the disabled population, I do know that I'm trying to get more teachers' aid, the things that I've heard about, as well as more devices to support students that are in need. I've heard also that, especially with their special needs population, there have been some challenges. And I think the philanthropic population has shown interest in leaning in and making sure we provide resources. And basically the balancing act that LA Unified is playing is to be sure to put the safety of all students above everything else, but it does leave for some open challenges. I know we're going to go to our breakout session in just a second, but I wanted to ask TJ, like, what would be some things that LAUSD should do? And if you do have those answers, I definitely would be great to help make the connection between LAUSD and any suggestions the community may have, because we have to serve all populations in need, particularly if schools are going to be out of session for a bit longer. Thank you.
Yeah, this has actually been a big concern in the disability community pretty much since March, that the issues with students with special needs and distance learning are really complex. They don't work in a lot of context, and unfortunately, what that means in an education system is we're going to look at more disproportional lack of access to public education, right, for those kids. So I don't have all the answers to it, but I think that this is one of those areas that requires folks to really sit and think and not try to put that one size fits all, like, okay, well, to protect everyone, we're going to do distance learning. Well, distance learning might not work for this population. And so essentially by instituting that, you're not giving them the same access to their education that they deserve. So I think that we have to reevaluate the one size fits all solutions to public safety in general.
Thank you. We're at 11:20. I'm just going to squeeze in one more question, though we still have quite a few. Thank you all so much for your thoughts on this. I'm going to go back to one earlier that I may have skipped over. Can you expand on folks with developmental disabilities in the LGBTQ community that are monolingual and how emergency response are working for them during a crisis? Or put another way, how these entities, how are they partnering with each other to meet the needs of these folks during emergency response, especially during COVID?
I'll take a stab at that. So the DD population, that's the developmental disability population. There are actually a number of curriculums that have been made available nationwide that specifically work to better inform folks with developmental disabilities about risk factors and how to better protect themselves. A lot of that training is creating routines, and routines tend to work really well for that population. And so, you know, the thing of a routine might be, you know, you get up in the morning, you brush your teeth, you take a shower, and you put your mask on, you know. So it's adding in additional training for those populations that are well suited to them. In terms of LGBTQ populations, we deal with that as well. The LGBTQ population within the disability community tends to be this overlooked minority that people overlook so much that they assume that it doesn't exist. And one of the things that we've been really big about at the center is really celebrating queer identities in the disability community during Pride Month and throughout the year. And so, this was a challenge this year, but it's also doing targeted outreach to those communities about increased vulnerabilities and how to bring resources to folks that are under-resourced. And so that's the, again, and that goes back to my earlier point about, stop asking communities just to prepare for themselves. It's how do we bring those resources to the communities to meet their needs of where they're at.
In the essence of time, we're going to transition now into, we're going to break all the attendees into 2 small breakout groups. There are about 5 to 6 questions we're going to try to work through. They're going to be moderators inside those groups, and then we're going to come back and have a small share out about some of the major themes that were in that arose during those conversations. So our specialist, Rosemary Punzlin, is going to break us up this moment. So
and
for
if you had questions that weren't answered by the panel, that they could probably fit into the questions we're asking during the breakout session. So again, a big thank you to the panel. I think you are invited to join a breakout session if you like. But otherwise, again, thank you so much for your time. We'll be following up with all of you. It's extraordinary. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Yeah, so we definitely are very low on time. We've maximized our time, which is pretty great. So I think we're just going to close. We were going to do a brief recap on what was discussed, but like I was sharing with my group in the earlier, before we broke out, that this is just the beginning of our conversation. So what we're going to do is we're going to compare the basic notes that we both collected in our 2 different groups and kind of try to synthesize those key themes together and build upon those as the main launching pad in our next coalition meeting. And for those, our plan is to hold these on a quarterly basis. So on this path, we're looking at October as being our next meeting. So we look forward to having you all attend that next meeting. And if you are aware of a colleague who you think would be a great fit for this conversation as well too, we definitely would welcome them to take part in this. As well, look out for a general post-event evaluation survey that we're going to send out via email in the coming days. That'll be coming into your email. And lastly, I want to thank the presenters again for their time and joining us today. Thank you to the attendees as well. Also, thanks to the people behind the scenes who helped to make this event a great production. Rosemary has been amazing. Dahlia, Ricky, Lourdes, Daisy, Stephen, all the many thanks to you all as well. I think that's all that I have. Stephen, any last comments on your end?
You hit it all. I just, again, want to thank everybody for what I think is the beginning of something extraordinary. We talked a little bit about the history of this coalition and that we are really sincere. This isn't a sort of a rebranding or repackaging. This is starting from scratch, doing it right, and making sure community and the city and other partners are fully engaged in serving our communities better. That simple. So thank you again.
All right. Yes.
Is that a wrap, Omari?
That's a wrap. Thank you all.
Appreciate it.
Have a good day.